The day my husband called me cruel to his mistress was the day I decided to let her win. But what Ethan didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I had already died once before. And this time, I would watch them destroy themselves from the front row. I remember the exact moment my heart stopped beating in my previous life. The cold concrete pressed against my cheek as blood pooled beneath my head, and Ethan's voice echoed above me, hollow and distant. "You brought this on yourself. Lisa, you made Rachel's life hell, and now look what you've done." Even as I lay dying, he was defending her. Even as my vision blurred and darkness crept in, he was painting me as the villain in a story where I had been nothing but a faithful wife who discovered her husband's affair. But death, it turns out, is not always the end. I opened my eyes on a Tuesday morning 3 years earlier, sunlight streaming through the same bedroom windows, where I had once cried myself to sleep every night. My phone buzzed on the nightstand, a text from my sister, asking if I was okay, if I needed anything. The date stared back at me, exactly 1 day before I would discover Ethan's betrayal. In my previous life, 1 day before I would find those intimate messages on his phone, before I would confront Rachel Martinez, before I would begin the slow, agonizing descent into a hell that would end with my murder. My hands trembled as I sat up in bed, the weight of impossible knowledge pressing down on my chest. I knew things that hadn't happened yet. I knew that in 24 hours, I would catch Ethan texting Rachel about their weekend getaway. I knew that Rachel would show up at our door 3 days from now, tears streaming down her face, claiming she was pregnant with my husband's child. I knew that Ethan's mother, Sherry, would side with them, calling me barren and bitter, saying Rachel deserved happiness more than I did. And I knew how it would all end with Rachel dead from complications during childbirth, with Ethan blaming me for the stress that killed her, with his mother's poisonous whispers convincing him that I was the monster who destroyed their perfect love story. I knew about the night he would come home drunk and furious, about the way his hands would shake as he pushed me down the stairs, about the sound my skull would make against the concrete. But this time, I had a choice. I could fight again, try to save a marriage that was already dead, attempt to prove my innocence to people who had already decided I was guilty. Or I could do something that would shock them all. I could step aside and let Rachel win. But on my terms, I could give them exactly what they thought they wanted and watch as their victory turned to ash. In their mouths, the morning air felt different as I made my decision, sharper, cleaner, as if the universe itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what I would do with this impossible second chance. When Ethan woke up an hour later, stretching and yawning beside me like the devoted husband he pretended to be, I watched him with new eyes. His dark hair was tousled from sleep, and for a moment, he looked like the man I had fallen in love with 8 years ago. But I could see through the facade now. I could see the way his fingers twitched toward his phone, eager to check for messages from her. I could see the guilt in the way he avoided my eyes, the way he kissed my forehead with lips that had whispered promises to another woman. "Good morning, beautiful," he murmured, his voice still rough with sleep. In my previous life, those words had made my heart flutter. Now they felt like broken glass against my skin. I smiled at him. A slow, knowing smile that made him pause. "Good morning, Ethan. We need to talk." The conversation that followed was nothing like the screaming match that had destroyed us before. This time, I was calm, eerily calm. I sat across from him at our kitchen table, my hands folded in my lap, and I spoke with the voice of someone who had already accepted defeat. "I know about Rachel," I said simply, watching as the color drained from his face. "I know you're in love with her. I know you've been planning to leave me." He opened his mouth to deny it, to lie the way he had lied for months. But something in my expression stopped him. Maybe it was the absence of tears. Maybe it was the way I looked at him like I was seeing a stranger. Maybe it was the fact that I didn't seem surprised or heartbroken, just tired. Lisa, I'm not going to fight you. I continued, my voice steady as a blade. I'm not going to beg you to stay or try to convince you that what we had was real. If you want to be with Rachel, then be with Rachel. I'll sign the divorce papers today. The silence that followed was deafening. Ethan stared at me like I had grown a second head, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. In his mind, I was supposed to fall apart. I was supposed to make a scene, to give him reasons, to paint me as the crazy, jealous wife who couldn't let go. Instead, I was handing him his freedom on a silver platter, and he didn't know what to do with it. You're not upset, he stammered, and I almost laughed at the confusion in his voice. Oh, I'm devastated, I said, and for the first time, I let a hint of emotion creep into my tone. My husband has been having an affair. My marriage is over. My life as I knew it is ending. But being upset won't change any of that, will it? If you love her, Ethan, then you should be with her. I won't stand in your way. He should have been relieved. He should have been grateful that I was making this easy for him. Instead, he looked almost disappointed, as if my calm acceptance had somehow robbed him of the dramatic confrontation he had been both dreading and anticipating. But I wasn't done yet. I had one more card to play, one more truth to reveal that would change everything. There's just one thing, I said, standing up and smoothing down my silk pajamas. I'm pregnant. The words hit him like a physical blow. I watched as his face went through a series of expressions: shock, joy, confusion, and finally, something that looked almost like fear. He began, then stopped, running his hands through his hair. How long have you known? I took the test yesterday. I lied smoothly. In my previous life, I had discovered my pregnancy 2 weeks after finding out about the affair, and I had told him immediately, hoping it might save our marriage. It hadn't. Instead, it had become another weapon in Sherry's arsenal, another reason to call me manipulative and desperate. This time, I would control the narrative from the beginning. But here's the thing, Ethan, I continued, my voice growing colder with each word. This baby is mine, not yours, not your mother's. Mine. You want to be with Rachel, fine. But you don't get to play happy family with my child. You don't get to have it all. His face flushed red, and for a moment, I saw a flash of the anger that would eventually consume him. You can't keep my child from me, Lisa. I have rights, do you? I interrupted, tilting my head to the side like I was genuinely curious. Because last I checked, you were planning to abandon both of us for your mistress. You can't have it both ways. You can't leave me for another woman and then demand access to the child you were ready to walk away from. The argument that followed was brief but explosive. Ethan raged and threatened, promised he would fight me in court, swore he would never let me take his child away from him. But I had heard it all before, in another life, and I knew how hollow his threats were. He wanted Rachel more than he wanted to be a father. He wanted his freedom more than he wanted responsibility. All I was doing was giving him permission to choose what he truly wanted. When he finally stormed out of the house, slamming the door so hard the windows rattled, I felt a strange sense of peace settle over me. The first move had been made. The game had begun. But I knew the real test would come when Sherry arrived. Ethan's mother had always hated me. From the moment her precious son brought home a woman who didn't worship the ground she walked on. Sherry Baldwin was a woman who believed the world owed her deference, who saw every woman in Ethan's life as competition for his attention and affection. In my previous life, she had been the architect of my destruction, whispering poison in Ethan's ear, convincing him that I was the villain in every story. She arrived 3 hours later, her silver hair perfectly styled, her designer handbag clutched in her manicured fingers like a weapon. I opened the door before she could ring the bell. offering her the same serene smile I had given Ethan. "Hello, Sherry. Come in." She swept past me without a word, her sharp eyes taking in every detail of the living room as if she were cataloging evidence for a future trial. When she turned to face me, her expression was a masterpiece of controlled fury. "What did you do to my son?" she demanded, her voice low and dangerous. He called me in tears, babbling about divorce papers and custody. Battles. "What kind of game are you playing, Lisa?" I settled into my favorite armchair, folding my hands in my lap with deliberate calm. "I'm not playing any games, Sherry. I'm simply accepting reality. Ethan doesn't want to be married to me anymore. He's in love with someone else. I'm giving him what he wants." Her laugh was sharp and bitter. "Oh, please. This is just another one of your manipulative schemes. You think if you play the martyr, he'll come running back to you. You think if you threaten to keep his child away from him, he'll choose you over her." The casual cruelty in her voice was almost breathtaking. Even knowing what was coming, even having lived through this before, I was still amazed by her ability to twist every situation to make me the monster. But this time, I was ready for her. "His child," I repeated, my voice deceptively soft. "That's interesting. I wasn't aware that biology worked differently for the Baldwin family. Last I checked, this baby was half mine." Her face flushed purple, and I could see her struggling to maintain her composure. "You know what I meant. That baby is a Baldwin. It belongs with its father and its father's family, not with a bitter, vindictive woman who can't accept that she's not wanted." There it was, the naked hatred that she had always tried to disguise as concern for Ethan's happiness. In my previous life, those words had cut me to the bone, had made me doubt my own worth and sanity. Now they bounced off me like rain on glass. "You're right about one thing," I said, standing up slowly. "I'm not wanted. Ethan has made that very clear. So I'm removing myself from the equation. He can have his mistress, his freedom, his perfect new life. But he can't have my child. That's kidnapping," she snarled, taking a step toward me. "I'll have you arrested. I'll make sure you never see that baby again." I smiled at her then, a real smile, full of warmth and genuine amusement. The expression seemed to startle her more than any argument could have. "Oh, Sherry," I said softly, "you still don't understand, do you? I'm not the one you should be worried about." Before she could respond, before she could demand an explanation for my cryptic words, I heard the sound of a car pulling into the driveway. Through the window, I could see Ethan's BMW, and my heart quickened with anticipation. Right on schedule. But it wasn't just Ethan who got out of the car. There was a woman with him, petite, blonde, with the kind of delicate beauty that made men write poetry and lose their minds. Rachel Martinez stepped out of the passenger seat like she owned the place, her hand resting protectively over her still flat stomach. Sherry turned to follow my gaze, and I watched as confusion flickered across her features. This wasn't part of the plan. In their version of events, I was supposed to be the obstacle, the bitter wife who needed to be removed. Rachel wasn't supposed to arrive until after they had dealt with me. The front door opened, and Ethan walked in with Rachel close behind him. He looked haggard, his usually perfect hair disheveled, his tie hanging loose around his neck. But it was Rachel who drew my attention. She moved with the careful, deliberate steps of a woman who knew she was walking into enemy territory. Her green eyes darting between Sherry and me like she was calculating the distance to the nearest exit. "Mom," Ethan said, his voice strained. "I didn't know you were here. I came as soon as you called." Sherry replied, her tone sharp with disapproval as she looked at Rachel. "Though I see you've brought company." The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Rachel shifted uncomfortably, her hand moving instinctively to her stomach, and I realized that this confrontation had never happened in my previous life. Back then, I had been the one fighting and screaming and making demands. I had been the chaos that allowed them to present a united front. Now, with me stepping aside, they were forced to face the reality of their situation without a villain to blame. Rachel is pregnant, Ethan announced, his voice carrying a note of defiance. We're going to be together. We're going to raise our children together. Children, plural. The word hung in the air like a challenge, and I saw Sherry's face go rigid with shock. She hadn't known about Rachel's pregnancy. Ethan had kept that little detail to himself, probably knowing his mother would have opinions about her son playing house with his pregnant mistress while his wife was also expecting children. Sherry repeated, her voice climbing an octave. Ethan, what exactly are you saying? It was Rachel who answered, stepping forward with the kind of nervous courage that came from having nothing left to lose. Mrs. Baldwin, I know this isn't ideal. I know the timing is complicated, but Ethan and we love each other. We want to build a life together. The silence that followed was absolutely electric. I could practically see the gears turning in Sherry's head as she processed this information. Her son was divorcing his wife to be with his pregnant mistress, while his wife was also pregnant with his child. It was a soap opera nightmare. The kind of scandal that would have the country club buzzing for months. And then, as if the universe wanted to provide the perfect punctuation to this moment, my phone rang. I glanced at the caller ID and smiled. Alex Shu, my former colleague from the marketing firm where I had worked before Ethan convinced me to quit and focus on being a wife in my previous life. Alex had reached out around this time with a business proposition, but I had been too consumed with trying to save my marriage to pay attention. This time, I was going to answer. Excuse me, I said politely, stepping into the hallway to take the call. Alex, hello. Perfect timing. His voice was warm and familiar, tinged with the slight accent that betrayed his Chinese heritage. Lisa, I hope I'm not catching you at a bad time. I have a proposition that I think might interest you. Through the thin walls, I could hear the heated conversation continuing in the living room. Sherry's voice was rising, sharp with indignation, while Ethan tried to explain himself and Rachel remained ominously quiet. It was beautiful, really watching them turn on each other without me there to serve as their common enemy. Actually, Alex, I said, loud enough for my voice to carry back to the living room. You're calling at the perfect time. I'm about to have a lot more freedom to pursue new opportunities. We talked for 10 minutes about his plan to start a boutique marketing agency, about the clients he had already lined up, about the partnership he was offering me in my previous life. I had been flattered, but ultimately declined. Too wrapped up in my failing marriage to see the golden opportunity he was presenting. This time, I said yes immediately. When I returned to the living room, the atmosphere had shifted dramatically. Sherry was standing with her arms crossed, her face a mask of cold disapproval, while Ethan looked like a man who was beginning to realize that getting everything he wanted might not be the blessing he had imagined. Rachel was perched on the edge of the sofa, her hands twisted in her lap, looking like she wanted to disappear. Well, I announced cheerfully, that was excellent news. I just accepted a partnership in a new marketing firm. It looks like my post-divorce life is going to be quite exciting. Ethan's head snapped up, and I saw something flicker in his eyes. Surprise? Hurt? It was hard to tell. But there was definitely something that looked like regret. You're not going to fight this? He asked, and there was a plaintive note in his voice that made me want to laugh. You're really just going to walk away from you? I shrugged, as if the question was absurd. Ethan, you've made it very clear that you want to be with Rachel. I'm not going to humiliate myself by begging you to change your mind. I have more self-respect than that. It was Rachel who spoke up then, her voice small and uncertain. What about the baby? I turned to look at her. Really look at her for the first time since she had arrived. She was beautiful. I had to admit that. The kind of ethereal, fragile beauty that made men want to protect and possess. But there was something else in her face, something that hadn't been there in my previous life. Fear, uncertainty, the dawning realization that destroying a marriage wasn't the same as building a relationship. What about it? I asked, genuinely curious about her answer. Well, she stammered, glancing between Ethan and me. Don't you think the children should know each other? Don't you think they should grow up together? Like siblings? The question was so naive, so utterly divorced from reality, that I actually felt a moment of pity for her. In her mind, we were all going to play happy family together. She would get Ethan. I would gracefully step aside, and our children would grow up as some kind of blended Brady Bunch fantasy. Rachel, I said gently, my child will grow up knowing that their father chose another woman over their mother before they were even born. They'll grow up knowing that their father was willing to abandon them for a new family. Do you? Really? Think I'm going to encourage a relationship between my child and the people who made that choice? The words hit their target with surgical precision. I saw Ethan flinch, saw the way Rachel's face crumpled slightly, saw Sherry's mouth tighten with disapproval. But I wasn't done yet. Besides, I continued, my voice taking on a thoughtful tone. I'm not sure how much time Ethan is going to have for additional children. Supporting two families is expensive, especially on a marketing director's salary. And that's assuming his job is secure, which, well, we'll see. It was a subtle threat, but they all caught it. Ethan's face went pale, and I knew he was thinking about the rumors that had been circulating at his company. The whispers about budget cuts and restructuring. In my previous life, those rumors had proven to be true, but it hadn't mattered because I had been there to support him through the transition. This time, he would be facing unemployment with a pregnant mistress and child support payments. What's that supposed to mean? Ethan demanded, his voice taking on an edge of aggression that I remembered all too well. I smiled at him, the expression sharp as a knife. Oh, nothing specific. Just that the market is unpredictable these days. Companies are always looking for ways to trim the fat, eliminate redundancies. I'm sure you'll be fine. The truth was, I knew exactly what was going to happen to Ethan's company. I knew about the embezzlement that was currently taking place. The way Rachel's secret partner was slowly draining accounts and covering their tracks. I knew about the investigation that would start in 6 months, the arrests that would follow, the way the scandal would destroy not just the company, but everyone associated with it. But I wasn't going to warn him. In my previous life, I had tried to help, had used my connections and expertise to support him through the crisis. This time, I was going to let him sink or swim on his own. The meeting broke up shortly after that, with Sherry storming out in a huff and Ethan following her, probably to endure a lecture about responsibility and family honor. Rachel lingered for a moment, looking like she wanted to say something. But eventually she just gathered her purse and left without a word, alone in my house. Not ours, since I would be keeping it in a divorce. I finally allowed myself to feel the weight of what I had just set in motion. In one morning, I had dismantled my marriage, secured my financial future, and positioned myself to watch my enemies destroy themselves. But the real satisfaction would come later, when they realized that letting me go had been the biggest mistake of their lives. The next few weeks passed in a blur of legal paperwork and new beginnings. True to my word, I signed the divorce papers without contest, asking for nothing beyond what was legally mine. I kept the house, my car, and my personal assets. I waived alimony, much to my lawyer's consternation, and I made no demands regarding Ethan's future earnings. The only thing I fought for was full custody of my unborn child, with no visitation. Rights for Ethan. My lawyer warned me that it was a long shot, that courts generally favored some form of shared custody. But I had an advantage that I couldn't explain to him. I knew the future. I knew that in 3 months, Rachel would give birth to a daughter she would name Emma. I knew that the child wouldn't be Ethan's, despite what everyone believed. I knew that Emma's real father was Robert Chen, Rachel's ex-husband, and that the affair that had produced the child had been going on long before Rachel ever set her sights on Ethan. I also knew that Rachel's pregnancy wasn't the romantic love story she was selling to everyone. She was using Ethan as a convenient replacement for Robert, who had refused to leave his new wife for her. The pregnancy was her insurance policy, her way of trapping a man into providing for her and her child. But the most important thing I knew was that Rachel wasn't working alone. She had an accomplice, Summerlin Hayes, Ethan's secretary, who had been embezzling from the company for months. Together, they had been planning to clean out the accounts and disappear, leaving Ethan to take the blame for their crimes. In my previous life, their plan had worked perfectly. Ethan had been arrested, charged with embezzlement, and eventually convicted despite his protests of innocence. He had died in prison, beaten to death by an inmate who had been paid by someone who wanted him silenced permanently. It wasn't until years later that the truth had come out, but by then, it was too late for justice. This time, I was going to make sure the real criminals got what they deserved. My first move was to reach out to an old friend from college, Marcus Webb, who now worked as a private investigator specializing in corporate fraud. I hired him to look into Rachel's background, particularly her relationship with her ex-husband and the timing of her pregnancy. The results came back 2 weeks later, and they were even better than I had hoped. Marcus had uncovered evidence of ongoing contact between Rachel and Robert, including hotel receipts and credit card records that placed them together on the night Emma was conceived. He had also found evidence of Rachel's previous attempts to trap men with false pregnancy claims, including a restraining order filed by one of her former boyfriends. But the real gold mine was what he had discovered about Summerlin Hayes. The woman had a history of financial crimes, including charges of embezzlement at her previous job that had been dropped when she agreed to pay restitution. She had also been in a relationship with a man named David Hayes, no relation, despite the shared last name, who had connections to several known money laundering operations. Armed with this information, I made an anonymous tip to the FBI's white-collar crime division, providing them with enough evidence to start their own investigation. I also sent copies of the evidence to Ethan's company's board of directors, along with a carefully worded letter expressing my concerns about potential financial irregularities. Then I sat back and waited for the dominoes to fall. They didn't have to wait long. 3 weeks later, Ethan called me in a panic, his voice shaking with barely controlled hysteria. "Lisa, something's happening at work. There are FBI agents in the building. They're asking questions about the accounts, about missing money. I think someone's been stealing." I listened to him babble about investigations and audits, about how his computer had been seized and his office searched, and I felt nothing but cold satisfaction. In my previous life, I would have dropped everything to rush to his side, to help him navigate the crisis, to prove his innocence. This time, I offered only polite sympathy. "That sounds terrible, Ethan. I'm sure it will all get sorted out. Lisa, I might need character witnesses, people who can vouch for my integrity. I know we're divorced, but you know me better than anyone. You know I would never steal." The irony was almost too perfect. The man who had betrayed me, who had abandoned me for his mistress, who had blamed me for every problem in his life, was now asking me to save him from the consequences of trusting the wrong people. "I'm sorry, Ethan," I said, my voice carefully neutral, "but I don't think it would be appropriate for me to get involved after everything that's happened between us. My testimony might do more harm than good." The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. I could practically hear his world crashing down around him as he realized that the woman he had discarded was the only one who might have been able to help him. "Please," he whispered, and the desperation in his voice was almost heartbreaking. "I know I hurt you. I know I made mistakes, but I'm innocent, Lisa. You have to believe that. I do believe you, I said, and I meant it. Ethan was guilty of many things: adultery, betrayal, emotional cruelty, but embezzlement wasn't one of them. But believing in your innocence and getting involved in your legal troubles are two very different things. I have my own life to think about now. My business, my pregnancy, my future. When I hung up the phone, I felt a strange mix of emotions. Part of me felt vindicated, watching the man who had destroyed my life beg for help from the woman he had thrown away. But another part of me felt hollow, empty, as if revenge wasn't quite as satisfying as I had imagined it would be. But that feeling didn't last long, because the real show was just beginning. Rachel gave birth to Emma on a rainy Thursday in October, exactly when I knew she would. I received the news from an unexpected source, Sherry, who called me in tears, babbling about premature labor and emergency C-sections, and how her precious granddaughter was fighting for her life in the NICU. I listened to her sob into the phone, describing how Ethan was beside himself with worry, how he hadn't left the hospital in 3 days, how he was already talking about being the best father in the world. And I said all the right things, made all the appropriate sympathetic noises, while inside I counted down the hours until the DNA test I knew was coming. In my previous life, that test had never happened. Rachel had died from complications during childbirth, taking her secrets with her to the grave. But this time, she lived, and living meant that eventually, someone would notice that little Emma looked nothing like her supposed father Dodd. It was Robert Chen who insisted on the test, showing up at the hospital 3 days after Emma's birth with lawyers and court documents. The confrontation was explosive. I heard about it secondhand from Marcus, who had been keeping tabs on the situation for me. Rachel had screamed and denied everything. Ethan had threatened to have Robert arrested for harassment, and the hospital staff had to call security to restore order. But DNA doesn't lie. And when the results came back 2 weeks later, they confirmed what I already knew. Emma wasn't Ethan's daughter. She was Robert's child, conceived during one of Rachel's secret meetings with her ex-husband while she was supposedly building a life with Ethan. The fallout was immediate and devastating. Ethan's call came at 2 a.m., his voice broken and slurred with alcohol. She lied to me, he whispered into the phone. The whole time, she was lying. Emma isn't mine. Emma was never mine. I sat in my kitchen, cradling my own growing belly, and listened to the man who had once called me cruel pour out his heartbreak to the woman he had abandoned. There was a part of me that wanted to hang up, to let him drown in his misery alone. But there was another part, a smaller, quieter part that remembered loving him once. "I'm sorry, Ethan," I said, and I surprised myself by meaning it. "That must be devastating." She played me. He continued, his words tumbling over each other in his haste to confess. "She made me think we had this great love affair, this destiny. She made me leave you, throw away our marriage for a lie. And now I have nothing. Nothing." The word hung between us like an accusation. He had traded everything: his wife, his family, his reputation for a fantasy that had never been real. And now he was alone, facing criminal charges he didn't understand, supporting a child that wasn't his, tied to a woman who had used him as a pawn in her own twisted game. "You have your freedom," I reminded him gently. "Isn't that what you wanted?" The bitter laugh that answered me was like broken glass. "Freedom? Lisa, they're going to arrest me. The FBI thinks I stole millions of dollars. My own company thinks I'm a criminal. Rachel won't even let me see Emma now that she knows I know the truth. And my mother, God, my mother is acting like this is all my fault. Like I should have known better." I could picture Sherry's reaction perfectly. The woman who had championed Rachel as the perfect daughter-in-law would now turn on her with the fury of someone who had been made to look like a fool. Sherry Baldwin had built her identity around being superior to everyone else, around having perfect judgment and impeccable taste. Having her son's mistress exposed as a lying, manipulative fraud would be a blow to her ego that she would never forgive. "What are you going to do?" I asked, genuinely curious. "I don't know," he admitted. "My lawyer says I need to distance myself from Rachel and Summerlin. That their criminal activity is what's making me look guilty. But Rachel is threatening to go to the press to tell them that I abandoned her and the baby when I found out about the paternity. And Summerlin has disappeared. One day she was at work. The next day her apartment was empty and her phone was disconnected. Of course Summerlin had disappeared. She and Rachel had gotten what they came for: access to the company, accounts, enough money to disappear forever, and a convenient scapegoat to take the blame. The only thing that had gone wrong with their plan was Robert's insistence on a paternity test. That one unexpected variable had unraveled their perfect scheme. "Have you thought about hiring a private investigator?" I suggested innocently. "Someone who could track down Summerlin, maybe find evidence that clears your name." There was a long pause, and I could almost hear the gears turning in his head. "Would you? Do you know someone who could help with that?" I smiled into the darkness of my kitchen. "I might. Let me make some calls." The next morning, I contacted Marcus and gave him a new assignment. This time, I wanted him to work openly, to be hired officially by Ethan's legal team to track down the real criminals. I provided him with all the evidence he had already gathered, along with some additional information I had pieced together from my previous life's memories. Within a week, Marcus had tracked Summerlin to a private airport outside the city, where she had boarded a private jet bound for the Cayman Islands. But she hadn't traveled alone. She had been accompanied by Rachel and Robert, along with Emma and what appeared to be several large suitcases. They had taken the money and run, just as I had known they would. But this time, they hadn't been able to cover their tracks completely. Marcus had security footage, flight records, and banking transactions that painted a clear picture of their conspiracy. The evidence was turned over to the FBI, and within hours, warrants were issued for all three conspirators. The money, nearly $2 million, was frozen in offshore accounts before they could access it. Rachel, Robert, and Summerlin were arrested at their hotel in Georgetown, and Emma was taken into protective custody pending a resolution of the legal issues surrounding her parentage. The news hit the local media like a bomb. Marketing executive cleared in embezzlement scandal. Read the headline in the business section. Pregnant mistress and ex-husband charged in corporate fraud case screened the tabloids. Ethan called me that evening, his voice lighter than it had been in months. "Lisa, I can't believe it. They arrested them. All of them. The FBI says I'm no longer a suspect, that the evidence clearly shows I was set up. My lawyer thinks the charges against me will be dropped by the end of the week." I could hear the relief in his voice, the desperate gratitude of a man who had been pulled back from the edge of ruin. But there was something else there too: hope. The dangerous kind of hope that made men think they could undo their mistakes, that they could go back to the way things were before. "That's wonderful news, Ethan. I'm happy for you. Lisa, I know I have no right to ask this, but do you think we could talk in person? There are things I need to say to you, things I should have said months ago." I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of the moment settling around me like a shroud. In my previous life, this was where the story had taken a different turn. Rachel's death had sent Ethan spiraling into grief and guilt, convinced that I was somehow responsible for the tragedy. This time, with Rachel alive but exposed as a fraud, he was free to see the truth of what he had done. "I don't think that's a good idea," I said softly. "We're both moving forward with our lives. Sometimes it's better to leave the past where it belongs." "Please," he whispered. And there was so much pain in that single word that it almost broke my heart. I know I don't deserve forgiveness. I know I threw away the best thing in my life for a lie. But I need you to know that I realize that now. I need you to know that losing you was the biggest mistake I ever made. The confession hung between us like a bridge I could choose to cross or burn. In another life, in another story, maybe I would have been the woman who forgave him, who gave him a second chance, who believed that love could overcome betrayal. But I had died for that kind of faith once already. I had paid the ultimate price for believing in redemption that never came, Ethan. I said, my voice steady and sure, I forgave you a long time ago. But forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It doesn't mean pretending that what happened didn't change everything between us. You made your choice when you chose her over me. I've made mine by choosing to move forward without you. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken regrets and might-have-beens. When he finally spoke again, his voice was barely audible. What about the baby? Our baby? Don't I have any rights as the father? It was the question I had been waiting for. The one that would determine the final shape of our story. In my previous life, this conversation had never happened because I had been dead before our child was born. This time, I held all the cards. Your parental rights were terminated when you abandoned us for another woman. I said simply, you can't walk away from a family and then demand to be let back in when it's convenient for you. But the court will see a man who left his pregnant wife for his mistress, only to discover that the mistress was using him in a criminal conspiracy. They'll see a man who showed no interest in his child until his other options were taken away. They'll see exactly what you are. Ethan, a man who only values what he's lost when he realizes he can't have it anymore. The words were harsh but true, and we both knew it. When he spoke again, there was a note of resignation in his voice that told me he finally understood. You're right, he said quietly. I don't deserve to be a father to your child. I don't deserve another chance. I just wanted you to know that I'm sorry for all of it. I know you are. I replied, and I meant it. But sorry doesn't undo the damage, Ethan. Sorry doesn't bring back the trust that was broken or the love that was wasted. Sometimes sorry is just too little, too late. We ended the call with a finality that felt like closing the cover of a book. But the story wasn't quite over yet. There was still one more chapter to write, one more account to settle. Sherry came to see me on a Tuesday afternoon in November, looking older and more fragile than I had ever seen her. The scandal had aged her, stealing the imperious confidence that had once made her so formidable. She stood on my doorstep like a supplicant, her designer clothes hanging loose on her diminished frame. May I come in? She asked, and for the first time in all the years I had known her, she sounded almost humble. I led her to the living room, the same room where she had once called me bitter and vindictive, where she had dismissed my pain and championed my replacement. Now she sat in my chair like a broken woman, her hands trembling as she struggled to find the words for what she needed to say. I came to apologize, she began, her voice barely above a whisper, for everything, for the things I said, the way I treated you, the way I encouraged Ethan to make the choices he made. I studied her face, looking for signs of manipulation or calculation. But all I saw was genuine remorse. The scandal had stripped away her illusions, forced her to confront the ugly truth about her own role in her son's downfall. What changed? Your mind, I asked, genuinely curious. She laughed bitterly, the sound like dry leaves rustling in the wind. Everything. Finding out that Rachel was a liar and a thief. Realizing that I helped my son destroy his marriage for a woman who was using him. Watching him lose everything because I convinced him that you were the problem. The admission hung between us like a confession at a tribunal. In my previous life, Sherry had never reached this moment of clarity. She had died still believing that I was the villain, still convinced that Rachel was the innocent victim of my jealousy. This time, The truth had found her while she was still alive to face it. I don't expect you to forgive me, she continued, her voice growing stronger. I know I don't deserve it, but I needed you to know that I was wrong about everything. You were a good wife to my son, and I should have supported your marriage instead of undermining it. I felt something shift inside me, a loosening of the anger I had carried for so long. Sherry Baldwin had been the architect of my destruction in my previous life. The poison in Ethan's ear that had turned him against me. But sitting here now, seeing her reduced to this shadow of her former self, I realized that her punishment had already been served. Apology accepted. I said simply, but you're right, it doesn't change anything. The damage is done, and there's no going back. She nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks. I know. I couldn't live with myself if I didn't try to make amends. For what it's worth, I think you're going to be an amazing mother. Your child is lucky to have you. After she left, I sat alone in the growing darkness, my hands resting on my swollen belly. The baby inside me kicked and turned, restless and strong. And I whispered promises into the silence. This child would grow up knowing their worth, surrounded by love and honesty, protected from the kind of poison that had once nearly destroyed me. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place 3 months later, when I gave birth to a healthy daughter I named Hope. She was perfect 10 fingers, 10 toes, and her father's dark eyes. But she would never know the man who had contributed half her DNA. As far as she was concerned, she had been created by love alone, wanted and cherished from the moment of her conception. Alex's business had flourished beyond our wildest dreams, and I found myself busier and more fulfilled than I had ever been as Ethan's wife. We had offices in 3 cities, a client list that read like a who's who of successful companies, and a reputation for excellence that had our phones ringing constantly. The final irony came when Ethan's former company went up for auction. The scandal had destroyed their reputation, and the legal fees from the investigation had drained their resources. Alex and I pooled our assets and bought the company for a fraction of its former value, renaming it Phoenix, marketing a symbol of rebirth from ashes. On the day we signed the purchase agreement, I thought about the woman I had been in my previous life, that Lisa had died believing she was worthless, that she had somehow deserved the betrayal and abandonment she had suffered. But this Lisa knew better. This Lisa understood that sometimes the greatest revenge was simply living well, succeeding beyond your enemy's wildest nightmares, and proving that you never needed them at all. The last I heard of Rachel, Robert, and Summerlin, they were sitting in federal prison, their stolen millions seized by the government, their reputations destroyed beyond repair. Rachel had lost custody of Emma, who was placed with Robert's parents while her biological father served his sentence. The woman who had thought she could destroy a marriage and steal a life had ended up with nothing but orange jumpsuits and regret. Ethan disappeared from my life as completely as if he had never existed. I heard through mutual acquaintances that he had left the city, taking a job with a small firm in another state, trying to rebuild his career and his reputation far from the scene of his disgrace. He never tried to contact me again, never asked about Hope, never attempted to claim the parental rights he had forfeited through his choices. And Sherry? Poor Sherry lived out her remaining years in a modest apartment, her society friends having abandoned her after the scandal, her proud legacy reduced to whispered gossip at country club luncheons. She died alone and forgotten, a cautionary tale about the price of pride and prejudice. As for me, I learned that revenge is not a dish best served cold, it's a dish that serves itself. When you simply step aside and let karma do its work, the universe has a way of balancing the scales, of ensuring that those who sow cruelty will reap consequences. Sometimes the greatest victory is not fighting at all, but simply refusing to be destroyed by those who seek to destroy you. I built a life of purpose and meaning, surrounded by people who valued and respected me. I raised my daughter to be strong and independent, To know her worth and never settle for less than she deserved. And every night, as I tucked hope into her bed and watched her sleep, I whispered a prayer of gratitude for the second chance that allowed me to write a different ending to our story. Because in the end, the best revenge is not just living well, it's living authentically, courageously, and completely on your own terms. It's refusing to let those who betrayed you define your worth or determine your destiny. It's choosing love over hatred, creation over destruction, hope over despair. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, it's watching from a distance as the people who tried to break you break themselves instead. Victims of their own greed and deception, architects of their own downfall. The woman who once called me cruel to his mistress never got to see how this story ended. But if he could have seen it, I think he would have understood that there are forces in this universe more powerful than cruelty, more lasting than betrayal, more beautiful than revenge. There is justice. There is truth. And there is the unbreakable strength of a woman who refuses to stay down when life tries to destroy her. My name is Lisa, and this is the story of how I died, how I was reborn, and how I learned that sometimes the best way to win is to walk away and let your enemies defeat themselves. Sometimes the greatest victory is simply surviving with your dignity intact, your heart unbroken, and your faith in tomorrow restored.